Consider this house. It looks something like the ideal American home. It is sizable but not too large. It's 2 stories. The grass is perfectly green and seemingly untouched. It even has a bush of American red roses out front and a white picket fence. What you don't know about this house, and what the family likely doesn't know either, is that it is infested with termites. This means that the house that the family finds comfort in will soon be ruined and collapse. Something similar has happened within systems in our country, more specifically in our American justice system. And over the past 2 years, I have spent time researching just how detrimental the effects of these termites of racial injustice, racial bias, and implicit bias have crept into our system. Let me start by telling you that America has the largest incarceration rate of any country in the world. Although America only constitutes about 4.4% of the entire world population, we make up 1/4, or 25%, of the world's prison population. Secondly, let me tell you that Louisiana, our home state, is home to the largest maximum security penitentiary in the country. The United States population is constituted nearly 13% by the African American population. An exoneration is the term used to describe when somebody's sentence in prison is lessened or completely eliminated because it was discovered that the crime either didn't take place at all or took place under much less severe, different circumstances than it was originally believed to. So that means that the person was wrongfully imprisoned. African Americans make up nearly 50% of this exoneree population. Although they are eventually freed, they spent time in prison for a crime that they did not commit. African Americans are 7 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted of a murder compared to white people. 7 times more likely. And African Americans are 12 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted of a drug offense than a white person. Now let me bring it a bit closer to home. You all heard me say that Louisiana is home to the largest maximum security prison in the country. This is known as Louisiana State Penitentiary, or Angola to many of us. Throughout the months of October and one time in April, Louisiana State Penitentiary holds the longest standing rodeo in the country, Angola Prison Rodeo. And many people from Baton Rouge and other towns throughout Louisiana visit it. And this is what the general population sees of Louisiana State Penitentiary. But what we don't see is how we have allowed termites to creep into this penitentiary. So I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you a story about a man who for now will remain faceless. All you need to know about this man is that his name is Albert Woodfox. In 1969, Albert Woodfox was convicted and placed in Angola Penitentiary for a relatively minor crime. He was supposed to remain in Angola for only a few years. But then, in 1971, inside of Angola Penitentiary, a prison guard was murdered. His name was Brent Miller. At the scene of the crime, there was an abundance of evidence, reports show. There was even a fingerprint that could have easily been scanned to link a single person or a group of people to this man's murder. But instead, they did not use this evidence. They didn't even bother to scan this evidence. They decided to arrest 4 men for the murder of Brent Miller using no evidence. 2 of them were let off free. They said, no, these men didn't do it, but they kept 2 of them, and they were eventually convicted and placed in Angola for a longer period of time for this murder. One of the men has the name of Albert Woodfox. Albert Woodfox's story is interesting because while he was in Angola, he wasn't just in the general population with the prisoners. He was placed in solitary confinement. He was placed in solitary confinement in a 6 by 8 foot cell for 43 years. This is longer than anybody in United States history has remained in solitary confinement. He was there for 23 hours a day, every day of the week, every week of the month, for 43 years. Now you may be asking yourself, if this man was in solitary confinement, What did he do? He must have done something. This must have been a disciplinary consequence or in order to keep other members in the prison, other inmates in the prison safe. But the truth was that whenever Albert Woodfox was in prison, before he was convicted for Brent Miller's murder, he founded a chapter of an organization within the prison. Now I'm going to show you Albert Woodfox. This is him. The first thing that you may note is that he is a black man. He is a black man convicted for killing a white man. And the organization that he originally founded in 1969 within Angola was the Black Panther Party organization, the chapter of Angola. The Black Panther Party did not, in the 60s and 70s, have the same violent reputation that it may have today. In fact, it was something similar to the Black Lives Matter movement. It was merely something to find hope in, for African Americans to look up to in times of extreme discrimination and injustice. And this factor, Woodfox's founding of this chapter of the Black Panther Party within Angola, is actually what kept him in solitary confinement for those 43 years. Now, you may be wondering, who was in charge of putting him in solitary confinement? It was the warden at the penitentiary, Warden Burl Cain. Cain admitted that Woodfox was a model prisoner. He was a model prisoner. And he later released a statement saying that Woodfox's associations with the Black Panther Party and their morals is the sole factor that he was kept in solitary confinement for all of those years. Cain feared what Woodfox would do if he was kept with the general population. He worried that he would use the Black Panther morals to keep other African Americans in hope during times of injustice. So he kept him in solitary confinement. Also, psychologists who infrequently visited the solitary confinement level of Angola reported that Woodfox was someone who was charismatic. He was charismatic and even kind. And whenever they would tell Woodfox this, Woodfox would ask, "Why don't you release me then? Why don't you do something about this? You see that I am not fit to stay in this cell. I don't belong here." And they would sort of chuckle and respond, "You know there's nothing we can do. You know this isn't our decision." So he remained in solitary confinement. Throughout his time in prison, he was re-indicted multiple times. This means that he was sent back to court to argue his case again. Each time, though, he was sent back to prison, unfortunately. The third time, something changed. It started the same. The judge told the jury, "This is a mere technicality. You all know the Miller family, you're from St. Francisville, and you should trust that this man deserves whatever he gets for killing Brent Miller." He told them, "You need not bother to look into the facts of the case. You just need to trust me that this man killed Brent Miller." What's most disturbing is that the jury listened. They didn't bother looking at the case. They didn't bother to note that there was an extreme lack of evidence. They allowed Woodfox to go back into prison. But like I said, though the third time started off the same, something changed. They re-indicted him. But then one woman who was on the grand jury returned home that night after confirming his being sent back to prison. Her name is Deidre Howard, and she is from St. Francisville. She went home, and she grew extremely panicked. She realized, "I just determined the fate of this man's life with less consideration than I put into buying a new refrigerator for my home." So she began to wonder, what can I do? This man clearly doesn't belong here. I looked into the evidence, and there is none. This is disturbing. So she did what she thought that she could. She began writing many people, one of which was Bobby Jindal, the current governor at the time. She wrote the judges who were in charge of the case, and she wrote the attorney general at the time, Buddy Caldwell. All of this was to no avail. No one responded, and she had no way of knowing if they even received her messages. In 2016, though, Caldwell left office, and there was a new attorney general. His name is Jeff Landry. She also wrote Landry, and she said, "You need to look into this case. Something is wrong." And he responded. He was the first to respond, and he said, Sure, I'll release Woodfox as long as he pleads no contest to manslaughter. This would mean that Woodfox would have to say, yes, I murdered Brent Miller, but it was an accident. And though this might seem fine and good, whenever Howard told Woodfox this, he was disturbed. Every part of him disagreed with his admitting to a crime that he did not commit. Even though he would be freed, it went against his Black Panther morals to say that he did something that he did not do when such an injustice was taking place. However, he had recently met with his brother, and his brother told him about how Woodfox's daughter was telling him about how hard it was for her to grow up alone. She had spent her childhood, her adolescence, and much of her adult life without a father, and it was affecting her. And when Woodfox heard word of this, he thought, well, this is enough for me to be freed. Even if it means going against my morals, this means that I will be reunited with my family and hopefully rekindle this relationship with my daughter. So he pled no contest to manslaughter. In 2016, he was released. Woodfox currently lives in New Orleans. He speaks to groups who are interested in prison reformation, and he even speaks to inmates themselves. But he's trying to lessen that in hopes of spending even more time with his family. Woodfox suffers from detrimental effects from not only being wrongfully imprisoned, but from spending so much time in a 6 by 8 foot cell. He suffers from feelings of constraintments in the night and throughout the day, often waking up in terror. Unfortunately, Woodfox's story is not the only case of how we have allowed these termites to creep in. It's not the only case in Angola, it's not the only case in Louisiana, and it certainly is not the only case in the United States. It is unfortunate that we have allowed this to happen, but now that you know, and now that I know, we must be cognizant of how we allow these termites of implicit bias, of racial injustice, of racial discrimination to creep into our everyday lives, into our thoughts, emotions, and dialogues, so that we can be more wary of how they have affected our system. And we must do this before the termites take over completely and diminish every system that we have. Thank you.